Mali's military leader has taken up the role of the country's defense minister after a deadly strike killed the man in charge. A presidential decree read on state television confirms Assimi Goïta will now serve as both the head of state and defense minister.
There is a war happening on this continent right now that most of the world is not watching closely enough. Not because it lacks drama, not because it lacks consequence, but because it is inconvenient for the narratives that powerful countries prefer to maintain about West Africa, that it is unstable, that it needs Western guidance, that its military governments are simply thugs who seized power and cannot be trusted to run anything. The reality on the ground in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is considerably more complicated than that narrative allows, and considerably more important. 3 countries that were colonized for decades, that had their economies structured around someone else's interests, that had their presidents chosen and removed by external powers. 3 countries that finally said enough, are now fighting for their survival against a combination of jihadist insurgents, separatist movements, foreign intelligence operations, and the specific fury of abandoned allies who are not accustomed to being told to leave. The Alliance of Sahel States, in French, Alliance des États du Sahel, the AES, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, 3 military-led governments, 1 confederation, 1 unified army, 1 war. I am your host. This is Africa Daily, and tonight we are going deep into the Sahel. Let me start with geography, because geography is destiny in the Sahel, and most coverage of this conflict skips it entirely. The Sahel is the band of semi-arid land that stretches across the African continent just south of the Sahara Desert. It runs from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east, roughly 5,000 kilometers. It is not a jungle, it is not a savanna, it is a vast, dry, sparsely populated transitional zone between desert and tropics, where rainfall is unpredictable, where farming is difficult, where water sources are contested, and where state authority has always been thin. Mali is the largest country in West Africa by land area, about 1.24 million square kilometers. To give you a sense of scale, you could fit South Africa inside Mali and still have room. But Mali's population of roughly 23 million people is concentrated in the south, near the Niger River. The north, which covers roughly 2/3 of the country's territory, is largely desert, largely ungoverned in any practical sense, and for decades has been a sanctuary for every kind of armed actor who needed space to operate outside the reach of any state. Burkina Faso sits to the south of Mali, landlocked, smaller, more densely populated, and for the last decade, the country experiencing the fastest deterioration of its security situation anywhere on the continent. UN reports from the region observe that entire communities have been emptied in Burkina Faso, northern Mali, and western Niger as violence between armed groups, intercommunal clashes, and military activity spreads. Niger is the largest country in West Africa by area, larger even than Mali, and one of the least densely populated countries on Earth. It shares borders with 7 countries, including Algeria to the north, Libya to the northeast, and Nigeria to the south. Its geography makes it both a transit point for everything, migrants, weapons, drugs, insurgents, and almost impossible to fully police. These 3 countries share one thing above all others that defines their current situation. They were all colonized by France. Their economies were structured around French extraction. Their currencies were printed in France. Their militaries were trained and advised by France. And their presidents, for decade after independence in 1960, were, in the frank assessment of the people who lived under them, chosen and protected by France as long as they served French interests, and removed when they did not. That history is not background. That history is the entire story. Part 2. The coups. What actually happened and why? Between 2020 and 2023, 3 consecutive military coups reshaped the political map of West Africa. Mali in 2020 and again in 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, Niger in 2023. Western media covered each one in largely the same way. A democratically elected government was overthrown, a military junta took power, condemnations from Washington and Brussels and Paris, sanctions threatened or imposed, demands for a return to constitutional order. What the Western coverage consistently failed to capture or chose not to capture was the street-level reality in each country at the moment of each coup. Because in Bamako, in Burkina, in Niger, when the soldiers moved, ordinary people did not take to the streets to resist. They took to the streets to celebrate. That is not a comfortable fact for the narrative of democratic backsliding, but it is a true one. And understanding why it is true requires understanding what democracy had actually delivered in these countries. In Mali, the government that was overthrown in 2020 was presiding over a security catastrophe. Jihadist groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State had been operating in the north and center of the country since 2012. France had deployed thousands of troops, Operation Serval from 2013, then Operation Barkhane from 2014. And after nearly a decade of French military presence, the security situation was not better. By most measurable indicators, it was significantly worse. Jihadist influence had expanded southward, civilian casualties were rising, and France was billing the Malian government millions of euros every month for the privilege of this deteriorating situation. The soldiers who overthrew President Keïta in August 2020 were not ideologues. They were professional military officers who had watched their colleagues die in the north for years while politicians in Bamako made deals with Paris and nobody was winning any war. Their argument to the Malian people was simple. This is not working. Let us try something different. The Malian people, by and large, agreed. In 2022, Mali's military government terminated defense agreements with France and accused French troops of failing to contain Islamist insurgencies and interfering in domestic politics. In January 2023, Burkina Faso's military government formally ended its military agreement with France and demanded the withdrawal of 400 French special forces from their country within a month. France left, bitterly. Then French president made speeches suggesting the African governments were ungrateful, that France had been fighting terrorism in the Sahel since 2013 and nobody was saying thank you, that ingratitude was a disease. The leaders of the AES had a different assessment of those years. Their assessment was that France did not stay in the Sahel to fight terrorism. France stayed in the Sahel because leaving would mean losing access to the uranium, the gold, the strategic positioning, and the CFA franc system that had kept these economies structurally dependent on Paris since 1960. Part 3. The CFA franc, the invisible chain. I want to pause on the CFA franc for a moment, because this is the piece of the story that tends to get the least attention in Western coverage, and it is arguably the most important structural element of the entire crisis. The CFA franc is the currency used across 14 African countries, a broad swath of West and Central Africa, most of them former French colonies. It was introduced in 1945. It stands for Communauté Financière Africaine, the African Financial Community, and until very recently, it was printed by the French Treasury. Let me say that again clearly. African countries, sovereign nations with their own governments and their own flags and their own armies, were using a currency printed and controlled by France. The CFA franc's exchange rate was pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French Treasury, which required these countries to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in Paris. UMOWA member countries share a single currency, the CFA franc, which is based on a convertibility guarantee by the French Treasury. If a country leaves UMOWA, It will have to recover its foreign exchange reserves, currently divided between the UMOWA Central Bank in Abidjan, 50%, and the French Treasury, 50%. Think about what that means in practice. Every dollar of gold or uranium or cotton that Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger exports, half of the foreign exchange it generates goes into a vault in Paris, not in Bamako, not in Ouagadougou, not in Niamey. Paris. This is not ancient history. This is not a colonial-era arrangement that was quietly dismantled at independence. This is the system that was still operating when the soldiers staged their coups. This is what they were rebelling against. Not just against terrorism, not just against failed security partnerships, against a 60-year-old economic structure specifically designed to ensure that formal political independence never translated into actual economic independence. Proposals have been made regarding a common central bank jointly with the introduction of a new currency to replace the CFA franc. The AES has put the replacement of the CFA franc on its institutional agenda. Whether they can deliver it, and at what cost, is one of the central questions of the next decade in West African economics. Now let me map the actual security threat that the AES is fighting, because terrorism and insurgency are words that carry heat but very little light, and the specific actors involved in the Sahel crisis are distinct, have different origins, different goals, and different relationships with the various state and non-state powers involved. The first and most significant threat is JNIMS, Jamaat Nasser al-Islam wal Muslimin, which translates roughly as the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. This is al-Qaeda's affiliate in the Sahel. It was formed in 2017 from the merger of several smaller jihadist groups and is led by Ayad Ag-Ghali, a Tuareg figure with deep roots in Malian North. JNIMS is the most militarily capable of the armed groups operating in the region. JNIMS is deeply entrenched in central and northern Mali, has expanded across much of Burkina Faso, and now operates in western Niger as well. Critically, and this is the detail that should alarm everyone paying attention, JNIMS, an al-Qaeda affiliate, has attacked more than 100 fuel tankers and abducted fuel truck drivers near the capital Bamako and other parts of the country. This is not a group fighting in a distant desert. This is a group conducting an economic blockade of a capital city of 2 million people. A group that, by repeatedly attacking the fuel supply chain, has brought the Malian economy close to suffocation. Through repeated attacks on vehicles supplying fuel to the landlocked country, the militants have come close to suffocating the Malian economy and destabilized its southern and western regions that were previously relatively unscathed. The third major threat is ISGS, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, also known as the Islamic State Sahel Province. ISGS is particularly active in eastern Mali, western Niger, and parts of northern and eastern Burkina Faso, especially in the tri-border zone. It has carried out large-scale assaults on military bases and villages. JNIMS and ISGS are rivals. They compete for territory, for recruits, for tax revenues from the local populations. They have fought each other directly. This internal competition within the jihadist landscape is a complication and an occasional opportunity for the AES. When the groups fight each other, they are not fighting government forces. The third actor is the Azawad Liberation Front, the FLA, a Tuareg-led separatist movement operating in northern Mali, formed in 2024 after a merger with other groups, including the Tuareg National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA. It has launched attacks against both Malian and Russian forces. The Tuareg question is the oldest and most complex strand of the Malian crisis. The Tuareg are Berber people, pastoralists, traditionally nomadic, with a historical territory called Azawad that extends over large parts of northern Mali and extends into Algeria, Niger, and Libya. They do not consider themselves ethnically or culturally Malian. Their demands for a homeland or autonomous region date back before Malian independence and have periodically erupted into armed rebellion ever since. The 2012 MNLA rebellion, which briefly seized control of northern Mali before being displaced by the jihadist groups it had allied with, directly triggered the French military intervention and set in motion the entire chain of events that produced the current crisis. Understanding the Sahel without understanding the Tuareg question is like understanding a fire without understanding where the first match was struck. Part 5. Russia, China, Ukraine, the geopolitical proxy war. Let me now address the elephant, or more accurately, the multiple elephants in the room. Russia, China, Ukraine, and the question of who is arming whom and why. After expelling French forces, the AES governments turned to Russia for security support. This was not an irrational decision, whatever Western commentators may say about it. Russia offered something France had not delivered in a decade of deployment: unconditional support. No demands for democratic governance, no human rights conditions attached to military aid, no press conferences about the importance of civilian-led transition, just weapons, fighters, and an intelligence partnership with no strings attached. The Wagner Group, later rebranded as Africa Corps after Wagner's leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash in August 2023, arrived in Mali first. About 1,500 personnel from the Wagner mercenary group initially, and since June, roughly 1,000 fighters from the Kremlin-controlled paramilitary group Africa Corps. Russian soldiers are also present, though in smaller numbers, in Burkina Faso and Niger. The Russian presence has produced documented results on the battlefield and documented atrocities. Reports from human rights organizations, including testimony captured in Al Jazeera field reporting, describe mass graves found at sites where Russian and Malian forces had operated. Civilian massacres, villages emptied not only by jihadist attacks but by the operations of the forces supposedly protecting the civilian population. Both the Malian government and Russia have denied these allegations. The truth, as with all war crimes allegations in active conflict zones, requires investigation that is currently not possible. What is not in dispute is the strategic dynamic. Russia is in the Sahel not out of brotherly African solidarity. Russia is in the Sahel because the Sahel is useful. It is a theater in which Russia can project influence, acquire access to gold and uranium and strategic minerals, demonstrate to the global South that it is a viable alternative to Western security partnerships, and, crucially, challenge French and American influence in a region where both had operated without serious competition. China has a different and arguably more structurally significant presence. Where Russia provides fighters and political cover, China provides weapons systems and commercial infrastructure. China signed a major defense procurement contract with the Chinese company Norinco in September 2024, covering weapons systems, armored vehicles, and training. The Chinese supplied equipment includes mobile air defense systems designed to counter drones, a direct response to the Tuareg and jihadist groups' growing use of drone technology in their attacks. China is not providing this equipment for free. The arrangement is commercial and strategic. China receives payment for the weapons and in exchange deepens its economic foothold in countries that sit on significant deposits of gold, uranium, and other minerals that the Chinese industrial economy requires. Then there is Ukraine, and this is where the story becomes genuinely alarming from an African perspective. Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate has publicly acknowledged providing support to Tuareg separatist groups in Mali, specifically in the context of targeting Russian Africa Corps personnel. Ukrainian officials framed this as legitimate warfare against Russian forces. From Kyiv's perspective, wherever Russian soldiers are operating is a legitimate theater of the Ukraine-Russia war, and degrading Russian military capacity anywhere on Earth serves Ukrainian national interests. From the perspective of Mali and the Sahel, this framing is extraordinary in its callousness. Ukraine, a country fighting for its own sovereignty against invasion, chose to extend its war onto African soil, into communities already devastated by a decade of violence by arming groups whose actions kill African civilians in order to kill Russian mercenaries. The African people caught between Russian forces and Ukrainian-supported rebels were not consulted about becoming a front in a European war. This is the geopolitics of the Sahel in 2025. Multiple foreign powers, each pursuing their own national interests, each using African territory and African lives as instruments of strategies that were developed in Moscow, Beijing, Paris, and Kyiv. None of these powers is in the Sahel primarily because it wants to help Malians or Burkinabe or Nigerians. Against this backdrop, jihadist blockades, separatist offensives, Russian mercenary operations, Chinese weapons deals, Ukrainian proxy operations, and the bitter aftermath of French expulsion, the AES is attempting to build something. On December 20, 2025, during a ceremony at an airbase in Bamako, the Alliance of Sahel States officially launched a joint military force known as the FUAES. The force brings together approximately 5,000 troops drawn from the 3 member states, designed to integrate air power, intelligence sharing, and coordinated ground operations. 5,000 troops across 3 countries, covering a combined area of roughly 3.5 million square kilometers. The mathematics of that ratio should give everyone pause. 5,000 troops is not enough to secure the Sahel. It is a beginning, a signal of intent, an institutional skeleton that needs muscle built around it over years, if the political will holds, if the funding materializes, if the 3 governments remain aligned, and if the security situation does not deteriorate faster than the force can develop capacity. On 29 January 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formally withdrew from the Economic Community of West Africa, ECOWAS, after providing the required 1-year notice. AES countries were all founding members of ECOWAS in May 1975. They have been replaced by a new institutional architecture, a joint AES passport, a new flag unveiled in February 2025, and a confederal levy on imports to support the newly created AES Regional Development Bank. At the December 2025 AES Summit in Bamako, the 3 leaders jointly launched AES Television, described in official communications as an instrument to counter disinformation and promote the region's narrative. General Assimi Goïta described it as a strategic tool to break disinformation campaigns and hostile narratives targeting the states. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who was appointed as the new AES rotating chair at the summit, warned of what he called a black winter, a phase of external threats, violence, and economic pressure aimed at undermining Sahelian sovereignty. That framing, the Black Winter, is politically charged, but it is not disconnected from reality. The AES countries are simultaneously fighting armed groups on multiple fronts, managing an economic situation worsened by the departure of Western aid and the costs of military mobilization, navigating a diplomatic landscape in which ECOWAS neighbors, including Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire, are openly hostile, and trying to build new institutions from scratch while the old ones collapse around them. I need to stop here and say something that the geopolitical analysis can obscure. People are dying every day in numbers that should generate global outrage, but instead generate quarterly UN reports that nobody reads. In Burkina Faso, entire villages have been abandoned. Farmers who cannot plant or harvest because armed groups control the roads and the fields. Children who have not been to school in years because schools have been burned or occupied or simply closed when teachers fled. Women who have been subjected to violence so systematic that humanitarian organizations have stopped describing individual incidents and begun describing patterns. In northern Mali, displaced families living in Mauritanian refugee camps watching their country collapse on a phone screen, unable to go home because home is contested territory between an army that may or may not protect them and armed groups that certainly will not. In Bamako, a city of 2 million people, shop owners shuttering businesses because Al-Qaeda's fuel blockade has emptied the streets of customers. JNIM's attacks on more than 100 fuel tankers near the capital are not abstract acts of political violence. They are an economic strangulation campaign that cuts electricity generation, raises the price of every good that requires transportation, and pushes the already poor population of one of the world's least wealthy countries further into destitution. This is what actual war looks like. Not the clean narrative of sovereignty versus imperialism, not the clean narrative of military order versus democratic chaos. A brutal, multi-sided, externally manipulated conflict in which the people with the least power are dying at the highest rates. Part 8. What comes next? The questions that will define the Sahel's future. Let me close with the questions that matter. Can the AES unified force actually fight? 5,000 troops have been assembled. Air power has been committed. Joint operations have been announced. The first real test, the coordinated airstrikes in response to the attacks on Mali's defense minister's family home, the recovery of the strategic town of Mekena, showed that the force can respond. It showed operational capability. But a response is not a strategy, and a tactical success is not a campaign. The question is whether the AES can build the sustained operational capacity to reduce jihadist influence across 3 countries, covering millions of square kilometers, not just in the next week, but over years. Can the AES achieve economic independence? The AES has announced proposals for a common central bank and a new currency to replace the CFA franc. These are not small institutional projects. Establishing a credible new currency requires foreign exchange reserves, central bank infrastructure, fiscal coordination, and above all, the confidence of the people who will be asked to use it. The AES countries are among the poorest on Earth. The economic resources required to make monetary independence work are not currently available. The question is whether they can be assembled in time. What is Russia's exit strategy? Russia is not a charity. Africa Corps fighters are not in the Sahel because Russia cares about Malian sovereignty. They are there because the Sahel provides access to minerals, influence, and strategic positioning. What happens when Russian interests and Malian interests diverge, as they inevitably will, because they always do? The AES governments expelled France when they concluded France was not serving their interests. The same logic applies to Russia. Whether they will have the leverage to enforce it is a different question. Can the AES maintain unity? 3 military governments, 3 different personalities, Gota in Mali, Traoré in Burkina Faso, Chiani in Niger. 3 countries with different specific security challenges, different economies, different ethnic compositions. The AES has already been drawn into spats with neighboring states. In April, Mali clashed with Algiers, prompting the 3 countries to freeze ties with Algiers. Burkina Faso regularly accuses Côte d'Ivoire of trying to undermine them, while Niger's generals make similar accusations against Benin. The AES is not an alliance of stable states. It is an alliance of governments under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The question is whether the pressure will bind them together or pull them apart. And finally, the question that nobody in power in the AES or in any external capital is asking loudly enough: what did the people of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger actually want? The street celebrations when the coups happened were real. The popular frustration with decades of corrupt governance and failed security was real. But street celebrations are not a mandate, and frustration with the past is not a plan for the future. The military governments have suspended constitutions and postponed elections. They describe this as necessary to deal with the security crisis before returning to civilian rule. That argument has merit. It also has a long history on this continent and everywhere else of becoming permanent. The African Union chairperson has called for a robust, coordinated international response to terrorism in the Sahel. Even ECOWAS and the AES appear to be edging towards an understanding on some form of open framework for free-flowing trade, travel, and migration that are fundamental to West African life. That cautious rapprochement between the AES and its neighbors, the possibility that regional solidarity might yet overcome the political rupture of the last 3 years, may be the most important development to watch. Because the Sahel's security crisis does not respect national borders. Jihadist groups do not stop at the Mali-Senegal border or the Burkina-Ghana border. The fuel that supplies Bamako transits through countries that are not AES members. The rivers that water the region's agriculture cross every political boundary drawn by colonial cartographers. The war in the Sahel will not be resolved by the AES alone. It will not be resolved by Russia or France or China or the United States. It will be resolved, if it is resolved, by West African countries finding a way to work together that transcends the political rupture of the last 3 years and treats the security and development of the entire region as a shared problem, requiring a shared solution. That is not naive. That is what the geography demands. That is what the history teaches. And that is what every civilian hiding under a table in Bamako, every family in a Mauritanian refugee camp, every shop owner who closed his doors because the fuel ran out, is waiting for someone, anyone, to finally deliver. This is Africa Daily. I will see you next time.